Simon is Interim Director of the Honours Programme and Associate Professor of Humanities in the Department of Philosophy and Humanities at Utah Valley University. She has received several teaching awards, and her scholarship on Dickens and Victorian literature and culture has been published in Dickens Quarterly, Dickens Studies Annual, Studies in the Novel, and 19th Century Context. Leslie is currently working on a monograph titled Heaps on Dickens and Modern Mathematics, a book manuscript on the heap as an image, an object, and a paradox in the 19th century imagination. Anna Blazer is a senior pursuing her Bachelor of Arts in Humanities at Utah Valley University. She has participated in various collaborative research and writing projects related to Dickens studies through the Utah Valley University Humanities Program, including serving as a research assistant for Leslie Simon in the writing of Recent Dickens Studies 2020, published in Dickens Studies Annual, Essays on Victorian Fiction. Anna enjoys reading, watching movies, and visiting museums of all kinds. Colin McNeil is a senior humanities student at Utah Valley University, minoring in gender studies. Colin served as a research assistant for Leslie Simon in 2020 in the writing of Recent Dickens Studies, published in Dickens Studies Annual. He owns and operates the studio salon in Salt Lake City. Victoria Morrison is from Manila, Philippines, currently living in Houston, Texas. She graduated in May from Utah Valley University with a BA in Humanities and a minor in French. Her senior thesis on William Bouguereau's painting Égalité devant la mort calls for Bouguereau, dismissed by art historians following the modernist tradition as unconventional and uninteresting, to be reassessed. Victoria served as a research assistant for Leslie Simon in 2020, again in the writing of Recent Dickens Studies, published in Dickens Studies Annual, and will apply to graduate programs in art history in the coming year.
Yay, thank you. and I want to echo what Trey said. Thank you for being here. This is a really wonderful turnout for the very final paper of the conference. And many thanks to Sean for inviting all four of us to be here. As many of you heard yesterday, or you've heard throughout the conference, in the fall I taught a senior seminar at UVU on narratology, and these were 3 of the 7 students in the class. And I designed the assignment sequence such that we would write a collaborative research paper together. And so the first half of the semester was spent reading Great Expectations very slowly alongside the narrative theory. So we were just applying it immediately to the novel. And then the second half of the semester, while we were also kind of watching Beyonce's Lemonade and season 2 of Fleabag and all of these other really wonderful things, we were also developing this paper. So it was an experiment in collaboration, which is unusual in humanities classrooms, as you all know, and application. And I had gotten the idea from when these 3, among other students, helped me with that article for the DSA, which, as those of you who have done it before know, is a beast. I mean, a really excellent opportunity, but a beast to write. And I might have procrastinated a little bit and needed a little help. And so some of them stepped up, and it was such a wonderful experience, a real highlight of my teaching career, working with them. And I felt like just the immediacy, I know I'm giving you a big background, but I want for you to understand how important I think the work that these students have done is. But just the immediacy of that work and being able to say to them, I know you've done annotated bibliographies before, but I'm gonna publish this. So it really matters, right? Like, you really got to find the good stuff. You really got to be able to tell me what all of these articles are about, and they did, and it was just such a great experience. So I said at the end of that semester, would you all want to push this further and write a paper together and see where it goes? And some of them said yes. And these are the 3 who have stuck with it to the very end. So our paper, what it's really trying to do is sort of capture and distill that magic that happens in the classroom. The conversations that we have, and how do you turn that, again, in the same way that scientists or social scientists do, how do you turn that into something that is an object that you could put on display for other researchers in the area? And so this was the paper that we landed upon and developed, arguing that Pip is in a state of purgatory throughout Great Expectations. And this really evolves from our observation week after week after week after week that it feels like Pip is running in place. It just feels like he's going nowhere. And Colin's going to walk us through that in a few minutes. But there is just this sense that he's he's a passive character and he's a backward-looking character. He goes home, I think, something like 9 times in the course of the novel. And even when he's not going home, he's thinking about home all the time. So even though we think of this as a Bildungsroman, I think Galia said this earlier today, right? We think of this as a Bildungsroman. Is it, or does it follow that linear plot that we expect of a Bildungsroman? And our suggestion is no. In fact, it feels very cyclical. And the question that we had then is why? Why does this novel, which of course is perceived to be this very perfect novel, and in some ways like the ultimate iteration of the Bildungsroman in the later part of Dickens' career, later part of the 19th century. So why is, it's not really the later, but as soon as Dickens dies for me, it's like, it's basically over. So in terms of that, why is there this sort of like looping backwards all throughout the novel? And so we really sort of arrived at the concept of purgatory. If I just use it's not gonna work, okay. Concept of purgatory, and our immediate resistance, personal resistance was, wait, but Dickens doesn't even like Catholicism, so why would we be using and applying Catholicism in the context of this novel? We know that he had no sympathy with the Romish church. He says that outright at the beginning of Barnaby Rudge in the preface. To Forrester, he calls Catholicism a curse upon the world. And in fact, we know he has no sympathy with any religious practice that smacked to him of fanaticism or superstition. Or if any of you know where the quote comes from, where he says that he calls religion unmitigated humbug, please tell us afterwards, because we keep trying to track down that source. We see it quoted everywhere, and we can't figure out who actually said it, or he said it, but where it comes from. And I love this quote by Dennis Walder, that in the novels, chapel-going, sermonizing are typically represented as ludicrous and reprehensible. Overt manifestation of the religious spirit is more often shown to be hypocritical and self-seeking than a genuine attempt to communicate with the deity. And of course, we see that with Mr. Wopsle in Great Expectations. He's a really excellent example of what we expect to see of the representative, sort of institutionalized religion in this book, right? He's an Anglican minister that's said to have a Roman nose, who said grace with theatrical declamation and punished the amens tremendously, which is such a good line. And so in spite of that, though, we have this character. I love this illustration where you see Pip at the crossroads. I do my crosswords every day, but the crossroads. Because to us, this is really an excellent illustration of the way he spends almost the entire novel, just sort of what do I do next? What do I do next? And of course, that's exemplified by the ending of the novel, which is really kind of a non-ending there too. And even the one that Dickens settles upon doesn't really feel very conclusive, right? It still kind of feels like we with Pip are in a state of purgatorial suspense, sort of trying to figure out where he's going to go or what he's going to do. So people who have studied purgatory in Dickens and studied Catholicism more generally in Dickens, and we're not alone, here I'm going to move forward and then come back. We're not alone in having done this. As for instance, writes a whole dissertation on the subject, Dickens and Catholicism, and he looks at purgatory in Dickens' novel, specifically Christmas Carol, as a theme, right? So sort of trial by fire stuff, and you see that a lot in other places. But we're really drawn to what Rebecca Raynoff does in her book, where she talks about purgatorial plotting. We're interested, again, really in plot, in this feeling that Pip is not progressing as a character the way that we keep expecting him to be. And so Rebecca Raynoff, specifically of Little Dorrit, calls attention to middle-aged male characters who are in a state of adult arrested development, in which personhood evolves gradually with periods of lengthy inactivity. And to us, this really feels descriptive of Pip in certain ways. And what Rebecca Raynoff says is that there was a new definition of purgatory emerging in the 1830s and 1840s, when you have theologians like John Henry Newman who are trying to sort of sell the idea of purgatory to Anglicans, and they're like, it's really not trial by fire. It's gentler than that, right? It's really just a state of kinder, gentler, much less eventful growth, right? It's not so punitive as what Anglicans had previously thought. And of course, this was a time when things were happening in Victorian England with Catholicism. You have the Emancipation Act in 1829 the rise of the Oxford movement in the next decade, and then acts of what were called papal aggression in 1850. And so Catholicism and purgatory, especially following the Oxford movement, were on the brain. And that is reflective in the fact that feel like I've said reflective a million times. Maybe it's just like the 3 days of talking about glass. But it's like there's 73 articles on purgatory in the journals that Dickens edited. Catholicism is discussed 700 times in those 2 decades worth of journal articles. I mean, that's really kind of amazing. But he's talking, in any case, people are talking a lot about purgatory at this time, which to us then means it wouldn't be so surprising if Dickens kind of had it on the brain as a model for the way that you could think about reflection, right? Like a state of, and these are some of the definitions we've come up with based upon a couple of the articles that appear right before Great Expectations were published or as it's being published. These are some definitions that we found really useful, that it's a period of suspense in which the soul suffers examination, enduring the tortures of self-reflection, even as it looks expectantly toward paradise, or as a transitional zone in which a person, character cannot with ease or certainty be classified. And that felt to us like Pip's experience, and maybe even like reading Pip's experience, which can be incredibly painful, right? Like you're sort of like cringing in those first couple hundred pages of the book. I mean, maybe all the way through for some of you. But in any case, we think that that's not without reason. So if you wanted to do the purgatorial reading of theme in the novel, that's there. That's not what we're doing today. But we just want to show you, we know it's there, especially the fire stuff with Havisham and Orlick is trying to put Pip into the fire, right? Pip throws himself into a fire, Orlick's trying to push him into a fire. Trial by fire is absolutely there in terms of imagery. The very first scene we have in the novel is Pip in a graveyard, right? So like images of death. Obviously these are all there, and really important stuff with parent-child relations. But we were just much more interested in purgatory as something that helped explain the narrative structures of the novel. We're going to focus more on plot, and we can talk later if you want about editorial detail, but we did want to mention really briefly something that we noticed about genre and setting too. Okay.
Yeah, so that was a huge part of our initial discussions as we were reading Great Expectations, and it was mentioned several times, a few times in the presentations yesterday, how oftentimes in Dickens novels it seems to be a patchwork of setting and genre, and we felt really strongly about that in Great Expectations. We start out in the marshes, which felt more romantic. There's mist, it's green, it's removed from the city, but then we also have this gothic energy with Satis House and Miss Havisham. It's dark, the building is very gothic, and then we go to the detective fiction in London. It's busier, there's lots more people, and again, Pip felt so unstable the whole time because it's not as if we went consecutively and then we kept on going. We just kept coming back to the marshes. We kept coming back to Satis House. We kept going back to London and then returning. So it was a really malleable ground that even Pip didn't seem to know where he was as the narrator. And so that's a really important backdrop as Colin is going to explain more about the things in the plot that we noticed.
So as Leslie said, we argue that Pip's character is developing cyclically and not linearly, like in a narrative tradition. So this comes from our textbook that we used during our class, and Ryan Richardson states that in a natural or conventional narrative, the role of the ending is to wrap up the plot, reveal all the mysteries to all the relevant characters, provide some sort of poetic justice, and resolve all the major problems that generated the story in the first place. While Victorian authors regularly attempted to satisfy these requirements, the more thoroughgoing realists and many modernists resisted such satisfying closures by pointing out its unreality, which Dickens does. And then let's move on to the next one. We don't get the satisfying closure in Great Expectations. We are left with two endings, which leave us wondering, is Pip going to be with Estella? Does he move to Cairo? And then also, like, his body is moving through space in a very cyclical way. At the very beginning of the novel, when he first meets Magwitch, it's the very first action that takes place as Pip is not moving himself, but he is being moved by Magwitch, and flips him over the headstone and moves him around. and then kind of sets Pip off on his way. And then the same thing with Havisham. She's walking him around and around the table, and both of these characters kind of suspend him between the physical and the emotional, Magwitch providing for Pip physically, and Havisham driving him emotionally. So he keeps returning home. He mentions home. Well, home is mentioned at least 144 times in the novel. He keeps thinking about home when he's in London. So while he is there, we don't really know what's going on around Pip, because his mind keeps going back to home with all of these questions of who his benefactor is, if he's worthy of Estella, and if he's kind to Joe. And then the people around him are changing in circumstance, which we certainly see. But Pip is not. He's waiting. People are getting married, people are dying, and he's just sitting there. And like I said before, even the ending is just a complete non-ending, one with Estella, one maybe with Estella. Will he return to England? Will he quit his job? Will he end up with his love? Is there happily ever after?
So with all of those things that we discussed in class, we just kept looking for an answer. Why do we feel this way? Why do we feel stuck with Pip? Why is Pip stuck? Why is this happening? And so we found, we looked to autobiographical narrative theory, and Martin Loschnegg goes over this in detail in his article, Post-Classical Narratology and the Theory of Autobiography. So the term autobiographical suggests that the narrator is retrospective in the formation of his or her identity through a reconstruction or a reenactment of the narrator's past. And so there are two important points. We're arguing that Great Expectations is autobiographical in two really major and distinct ways. The first one is because Pip is telling the story retrospectively as if he is producing an autobiography. He's on his own autobiographical journey. And the second is, it's widely understood that Great Expectations addresses some level of autobiographical content from Dickens' own life and childhood. And our focus is on the fictional autobiography. We will address the aspect of Dickens' childhood later on in this presentation, but our primary focus was on the fact that Pip seems to be writing his own autobiography. He's telling the reader the story of his life and his childhood. And so the retelling, so Loschnegg, he talks about how the retelling of the narrator's life events, so his life events, it happens in such a way that causes the implotment to result in the narrator being self-made or created through an examination of his past. And that's kind of what causes that feeling of being stuck in purgatorial implotment. And so this diagram was really important for us. These were the major key terms we were using when we discussed the novel. So you can see there's narrating eye and experiencing eye. And these were actually, present Pip and past Pip were, I think, some of the very first terms that we came up with. And it wasn't until we found Martin Loschnegg's article that we kind of put present Pip with narrating eye and past Pip with experiencing eye, because it's present Pip that's telling the story, and it's past Pip that's going through the story and kind of is that past character. So Loschnegg says, if one conceives of autobiography as a psychological activity which creates rather than depicts, identity, retrospection, and the double aspect of the self involve the construction not only of the experiencing, but also the narrating self. And so it takes both past and present selves to tell the story, which is exactly what this diagram shows us. So the implotment of the story is occurring according to present Pip, who's telling the story. He's the dictator here. He's going to decide what is going to be told. And Pip is having purgatorial experience because his formation of identity is happening as a result of his past and present selves melding together. Not yet, sorry. Another really important part of this diagram also just helps us to know that in structuralist narratology, normally the narrating eye and the experiencing eye are different. They're distinctly two different roles, but we argue that Great Expectations actually collapses these roles, and kind of those two roles are overlapping in Pip's character. And so autobiographical narrative theory, it regards the autobiographical act as an experiential site. So the narrating eye, the act of narration, is actually also experiencing along with the past version of the self. You can go ahead to the next one now. And another thing I will say is that as time and space are moving, as narrating eye and experiencing eye are moving forward, as experiencing eye is gaining new insights, narrating eye is simultaneously doing the same thing. So they're kind of creating each other in a simultaneous process. Loshnik also references Monica Fludernick in his article, and she outlines a model of cognitive narratology that really supports his theory of experiential narration. She says experientiality refers to an individualized rendering of experience as reflected in human consciousness, which then creates an identity from the experience that the subject has relived through telling the story. So in other words, what's happening is a stream of consciousness that's created by the narrating eye, and the experiencing eye is actually creating, like Loshnik says, but it's that stream of consciousness that's creating the identity through the narrative act.
Yeah. So with this theory in mind, we kind of have two different things to look at, and these are sort of the two things that set Pip as a narrator up in this purgatorial state. So first, we have in classical or conventional narratology, the act of narration is understood as something that's very separate from the experience of the novel. So the narrator is kind of outside the story in some sense, whether it's from like third-person point of view, or there's a kind of a clear distinction made by the narrator between space and time of the narrator and the story's characters. And the narrator is really a lens through which readers receive the story as they interpret and report and evaluate the events. However, as we've established, Great Expectations is an autobiographical narrative, and because of this, active narration is experiential. So this means that present Pip, as an autobiographical narrator, is reporting and interpreting and evaluating past Pip's story for the reader, and he's also experiencing it himself, as Victoria was kind of talking about. So he's really a part of the story, and he collapses into it because of its autobiographical nature, and we as readers can really see him grappling with these kind of two roles. He really veers between the two. So at some points he's creating this intentional distance between his present and his past self, and then at other points he collapses into the story and he really reveals himself as an experiencing character. So here's a couple examples. With this first one, Pip kind of tells us of his actions and his intentions with Joe as he begins to receive an education. So he says, "Whatever I acquired, I tried to impart to Joe. The statement sounds so well that I cannot in my conscience let it pass unexplained. I wanted to make Joe less ignorant and common, that he might be worthier of my society and less open to Estella's reproach." So this is really an example of present Pip as a narrator who is interpreting and reporting and kind of reflecting on past Pip's actions for us. And he's trying to get some distance, which looks maybe like a moral or ethical distance in this case, trying to really separate his sense of morality and what he would do. And he uses the past tense of wanted to kind of indicate a gap in time, as well as that sort of moral gap, and communicate that he no longer feels that way. He no longer wants that for Joe, and he really disavows past Pip's desires. Then with this second example, Pip is reflecting on his apprenticeship with Joe, and it's clear that he really hasn't come to terms with it at the time of writing. So he says, "I know right well that any good that intermixed itself with my apprenticeship came of plain contented Joe, and not of restlessly aspiring discontented me. What I wanted, who can say? How can I say when I never knew?" So he really pulls the past and present together in this moment, rather unintentionally. He uses the identifier of me, and he's still restlessly aspiring and discontented, and he can't help but identify himself with those words, with me and I, and he switches between past and present tense in that last sentence, as he kind of questions himself and his desires. So he uses wanted, but also can instead of could. And then with this last example, he is talking with Biddy about Estella and about his feelings for Estella, and he says, "Then she softly patted my shoulder in a soothing way, while with my face upon my sleeve I cried a little, exactly as I had done in the brewery yard, and felt vaguely convinced that I was very much ill-used by somebody, or by everybody, I can't say which." So once again, he's saying he can't say which, as opposed to he couldn't say which in the past tense. And this just really shows his collapse into that experiencing character and an experiencing eye that he can't help. So these examples of present Pip's kind of present slippage between the narrating I and experiencing I really show present Pip as a narrator, how he is keeping himself in a state of purgatory. He's keeping his past self in a state of purgatory, and it's through these experiences and this collapse that we really see that. And he just keeps himself in this intermediate place. And this is manifested in such a way that the purgatorial plotting of past Pip mirrors the purgatorial frame of mind of present Pip. So if past Pip seems reflective or unsure about a certain matter, it's only a result of present Pip's inability to arrive at a conclusion about how he himself feels at the time of writing and interpreting. And it's because of this that we really maintain the importance of a greater focus on Pip's role as a narrator in the novel as opposed to his role as a character or as the protagonist, given that his reflective mental state gives this purgatorial structure to the plot as well as the themes and genre of the novel as a whole. And so this kind of in turn calls our attention to the mind frame of Dickens himself at the time of writing, as he was kind of undergoing his own personal and professional turbulence. So this graphic kind of helps us understand how that may have played into his writing. So in the middle we have the experiencing I, or past Pip, being narrated by the narrating I, or present Pip, who is written by the implied author or the brand persona kind of Charles Dickens, you know, the Charles Dickens, and he has a certain brand to keep up with in his writing. And then he's obviously influenced by real life, actual author Charles Dickens, whose life is influencing what he's writing and what he chooses to include and how he writes Pip. And we know that at this time Dickens was going through a separation from his wife Catherine, as well as switching publishers. So that kind of sets him up to, we can see how he was experiencing maybe his own kind of purgatory and how that would impact us as readers on the very, outside. And how we can kind of feel that, like Leslie was saying, as we're kind of dragging ourselves to those first pages, like trying to have an ounce of sympathy for him when he just keeps making mistake after mistake. So this kind of shows how everybody's in a state of purgatory at the end of the book. So that is the end of our example.
Now I would like to invite everyone to ask questions. Do we need more chairs? One more chair?
Here, I can stand.
That's okay. Oh, there we go. Do we need one more chair?
Sorry.
So, any questions, comments? Professor Bracken?
I'm fascinated by your last slide here, the internesting sequence that you found. And I want to recall one passage after Pip and Herbert fight, and Stella feeds Pip as if he were a dog in disgrace. And Pip says something like, I felt so hurt, angry, sorry, spurned. I cannot hit upon the right I cannot hit upon the right name for the smart. God knows what his name was. And all that is again what you're talking about of Pip looking at the thing both as experience and narrating the experience and experiencing the narration. And then we do have a record of what the implied author and what the real author are doing, because we've got Dickens' manuscript. And he's not sure what the right name for the smart is. He crosses out a couple of those words and writes in a couple more in between the lines. And even then he's not done with it, because there are words that appear in the printed text that aren't in the corrected manuscript. He looked at it again in proof and thought, okay, I gotta get spurned in there, put spurned in. So that's very much that kind of nesting and multiplicity of levels of narration. I think it's terrific, very nicely done.
That's really nice, thank you.
That was a great example.
Another thing that we thought about is I did have them read beginning to end Edgar Rosenberg's edition of the book. So, we looked at a lot of the manuscript notes that Edgar had included for us, and there are not that many, right? Dickens doesn't leave us many notes for Great Expectations, unlike in all of the other novels. So even that, to me, felt, if we're talking about like narrative structure and the way, like the design of the book, there are a lot fewer signposts for us as readers, sort of looking back, trying to figure out even like timing, how old is Pip? You know, everybody sort of debates that point, how old is Pip throughout the novel, what is the timeline? And so in any case, that even to us felt like it was sort of putting us in a kind of purgatorial state where we're like, where are we, when are we, what's happening? Like we're just in this sort of intermediate zone throughout. And that's a really great example. Thank you.
Yeah, all very interesting papers. It struck me that there were some interesting connections, in particular between Douglas's paper and Leslie and team, insofar as both presentations seem to be to do with the relationships between narrative structure and the kind of formation of identity in texts and metaphysics, perhaps, or big ideas. And it kind of raised echoes in my mind with various passages in Dickens where he hints at, well, uncertainty about what comes after life on Earth, but also what comes before life on Earth. I mean, the passage you were talking about, Douglas, with Betsy Trotwood Copperfield, who never comes into existence, returning back to the world of dreams and shadows. What is that? What is that strange sort of afterlife, which is actually before life? And yeah, and in the context of that kind of thing, making connections with the multiverse, for example, you were using it perhaps in a kind of metaphorical way, but it doesn't seem that far-fetched in terms of the things that Dickens might have been open to and prepared to think about. And so I'm just wondering, well, whether the group or Douglas would be interested in sort of commenting on the connections between those two papers themselves, or whether any of you have any feelings about where Dickens's kind of doubts and speculations about these matters come from, the sort of sense that we're actually sort of in purgatory on Earth, in a kind of indeterminate strange state between another previous strange state and a future strange state. Is this just Dickens? Is it to do with his personal experiences and so forth? Or do you detect influences from theological or perhaps philosophical ideas that were running around at his time? I mean, the kind of equivalent of the kind of multiverse discussions that's going on now.
I mean, mine's still very early, work in progress, and I was like going through all the Dickens books I've read, most I think at this point. I'm still trying, but like Pip was definitely one that I was like, Pip needs to be in this chapter or whatever it ends up being. But because he's like the focus on the name of Pip and how it's like you cannot change your name when you go to London. It's the idea that like no matter like he has to grow into the name of Pip, whereas David's like, okay, I have like all these names, which one do I want to pick? And then the I'm blanking on his name, the criminal in Little Dorrit who has like multiple names. They're all trying to like, everyone else is trying to conflate them, and he's trying to like separate them all. So it's like this question of identity that I haven't fully worked out quite yet, but it's just like I've been able to find like different uses of identity. Like every novel, story, whatever that I've read by him has had this like question of like, okay, this name means this, and like every character has like a importance to their name. It's just between like the multiverse that I found in David Copperfield versus the like singular identity of Pip or Oliver Twist, or the like the criminal from Bill Jordan's name I just cannot remember right now, who has like multiple names. Like it's just I'm trying to work on like how what is trying to say. I'm sorry, I'm still like trying to think of these things.
You know, we even talked in class about how even the name Pip being palindromic, it feels kind of like he's in purgatory, right? Like he's back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. So we didn't talk about names in our paper, but that was something that we talked about in class, certainly. And I think the thing that just really struck me as we were getting to the end of this stage of the project, meaning like last week, meeting up and trying to figure out where are we now, was I think it's a big deal just to sort of reorient our focus from the character of Pip in the novel in right, the experiencing eye back out to the narrator, and to think he's a character too. And I know that we know that, but really spending time to think about that, like who is the character Pitt? Throughout our reading of the novel, I kept asking the students to think, like, picture where he's sitting when he's writing this for us, right? Where is he sitting? What is he doing? How old is he? What is he wearing? What is the context? And so really reorienting that, and then thinking about the fact that he's holding himself in place, right? He, the narrator, is the one holding himself, dangling himself through the plot, and not letting himself, like, move forward, whatever that moving forward is that we want to experience. So it's not like a godlike character who's doing it, it's him. And that for me was really fascinating, because then what's the goal? Is that just him? We're not focused on trial by fire as imagery, but is that him just sort of like maybe punishing himself? Maybe we disagree on whether this is like punishment or just processing, right? Is this about the soul or is it about the mind? But still, the fact that he's the one doing that and really running the show, I think is, I don't know, for me that's interesting, and there is a larger theological question there, but I don't know. Thank you for asking.
And there is Kim.
Slightly related. I was wondering if the authors of either of the last two papers, if you watched the Dev Patel version of Great Expectations, and what you think about that, and the idea that sometimes they show the character like writing, and the other characters that he's thinking of are like there with him, even though they're not really there. It's like the ghost of them. So I was just wondering if you have any ideas about that.
I haven't seen it. That sounds really interesting though.
The Patel Great Expectations or David Copperfield?
David Copperfield, I'm sorry.
Okay. I do love that movie. I cut out a part of my thing where I had talked about Dora in the David Copperfield adaptation, because like very much my argument about self-awareness and be okay with who you are, because in my multiple readings of David Copperfield throughout my career, I've been very like upset with how Dora's story ends, just like she has to die just so we can move on to Agnes. It always upset me. So I very much love in the Patel movie that she just like comes to this moment of self-awareness where she's like, I don't fit in your life, I'm out of here, be happy with Agnes. So I feel like the movie is very much doing what I'm trying to argue with the idea of like, come to these terms of self-awareness and then you can like live your potential, and Dora can live a happy life apart from David.
Professor Patton. Yes.
A question for all of you. We started out with the traditional novel having a happy ending and all wrapping it up at the end. And we now know with a long series that you don't wrap up that end for several years. And I'm sort of wondering, all of your papers were about a kind of plurality or indecidability or a change that may be another way of staying still, as you all were saying about Pitt. How do you feel as a reader picking up a book with some expectation that it will resolve? So what happens to you when the thing keeps getting complicated? Is that good, disturbing? How does it feel like for all of you at all your ages?
I can say it's deeply frustrating, like very deeply. I mean, even as you see it just throughout the book, it's when you start to feel that it's not conventional, it's not leading to this point of resolution for Pip or at any point. But even at the ending, we were specifically not allowed to read ahead because I think of that disappointment and that frustration, and maybe not even being able to continue reading if we knew the end. And we had so many discussions of which ending was better and which one we preferred, and I mean that was the start of class. At every point where we were finishing the book, it was, what do you guys think of this? How do we feel about the different endings? How do we feel that there are different endings? I think it's just very upsetting or very off-putting maybe, just to have to come to terms with there's not an ending that looks the same as you'd be used to, and it's not coming, and he's not here to write anymore. So you have to figure it out, come to terms with it for yourself.
is the token old person on this panel. I very much enjoy it when it is not resolved and is left in pieces. Now, part of it may be informed by, you know, the so-called college novels when I was in college were postmodern novels. So you're sort of raised with that expectation in a way. And then you can see in Dickens like a forerunner of some of that. And I very much prefer that as an ending. You know, the options and that kind of thing, the openness of it.
I do tend to like novels, movies, whatever, with ambiguous endings. But I know from a couple semesters ago when I taught a fiction course, and I had my students do like a mini unit on unfinished novels, and they were all excited about this beforehand. They're like, "Oh, cool! We're gonna like see these books that are in progress." And then when we got to the end of Edward and Drood, they all like revolted in the classroom. They're like, "Why did you make us read this? Why does it just end like this?" So I was like, the idea for my students at least of like an unfinished novel was very exciting to them, and then in reality they hated it beyond belief.
But what I think you're calling to attention, and Trey just said, my own expectations. I mean, this novel is about Pip's expectations, but it's also calling to mind our own. And what is Dickens playing with in terms of the plotting of the novel and what we're expecting to see and then what he actually gives us. And so what, you know, part of our argument is that even though we think of this as the Victorian novel, we're saying it's kind of proto-modernist in a way because it's not doing that thing that we expect Victorian novels to do. And of course, Victorian novels are more complicated than people like to give them credit for being to begin with, but it is sort of anti-conventional, and so he is playing with our own sense of expectation. And what I'd like to do, if we end up having time for it in the article, is talk about how expectation is itself a sort of philosophical or psychic state that's purgatorial in shape, right, and in tone, that it's something you're sitting in anticipation, looking forward to, but the arrival means expectation is gone, right? The ending means it's no longer there. So, in any case.
I have a question. I'm struck by this image of Dickens sort of stuck in this strange loop at this point in time, just sort of thinking about his desire for a new beginning, you know, and his desire to erase the past in this particular moment in time. So how does, I'm not sure if you perceive that as sort of a desire on his part, but if you do, I mean, what does that mean about this strange loop, you know, that he seems to be in? Which is, I think, the way you were describing his sort of life at this point in time.
Yeah, I think we're suggesting that just in the same way that Pip, there's sort of a tension in the novel between Pip as an experiencer and a narrator. There's also a tension at this moment for Dickens between the persona and the man, the person. And of course, he is not in his actions being representative of the persona. And so how are those two things narrating each other, being narrated by each other? But then, yeah, he's in that purgatorial state in regard to his relationship with Catherine and when he started with Nellie. And of course, we read your book and we looked at that pretty closely and trying to figure out, most of the quotes we were trying to pull from your book were really about Catherine being in a state of purgatory. And I'm like, but Dickens is too, right? Like, we're gonna find a quote that says that, so we need you to add one, if you don't mind, a footnote somewhere. But it feels like that, doesn't it? That he's kind of, yeah, he wants, yes, agreed. He wants that new beginning. And so our question for ourselves was, does the act of narration, if narrative is a purgatorial act, if autobiographical narrative is a purgatorial act, does it hinge upon expiation? Is he trying to absolve himself through the act of writing? And that's not something I think we agreed upon. Some of us felt like, no, this is just, he's in therapy, or he's processing, and then others of us were like, no, he's, looking for forgiveness. And so I don't know if the rest of you have thoughts, but we talked a lot about that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But,
yes. Okay. I love it that we're ending this conference on a note of suspension and multiplicity and not in any kind of linear fashion. So I have a question for Trey. I don't remember where I read it might have been in your own work, so I really don't remember where. But someone talking about Jenny Wren in terms of the spinning Jenny. So I was very convinced by your Wren reading, and I think it's beautiful and illuminating. And I just wondered if you also had thought about that.
one of the issues when I started to think about this paper was, because again, it was called many names, and it was gonna be a much more broadly focused paper, but then to do it in 20 minutes, you realize it's got to be really focused on the thing. That's certainly something that was, certainly spinning Jenny was an obvious kind of echo of Jenny as well. But yes, I mean, that is
I don't even know what a spinning Jenny is, or like, I guess I don't know.
Well, I know it was
Like a
developed in
general-
the 18th century, but I couldn't at this point.
Or why it's called a Jenny, I don't know, all of this made me think, and then the cleaver, it's quite interesting.
Well, one of the things that interests me about her name, which I didn't get to in the paper, still looking at, is how Dickens refers to her. Either how the characters refer to her, how Dickens, the narrator, refers to her. He very rarely uses the word Jenny with her. Because obviously you can do word counts by using text and so forth. The characters that refer to her as Jenny are almost always Raya and Lizzie for obvious reasons, because you're close to her. Does anybody have an idea of what would be the number one way he referred, he being the number one term in the novel that is used to refer to Jenny Wren? Is it Jenny Wren? Is it Miss Jenny Wren? Is it Miss Jenny? Is it Miss Wren? Is it person of the house? Is it doll's dressmaker? Is it the little creature? Because he uses that phrase a lot. What would it be? Because one of them is far outweighs the other ones. Twice as much. Miss Wren. Miss Wren. Which is not, some of that, of course, is playing on the use of Miss at the time, which has been much talked about when you use Miss. Well, supposedly, that's not always the case in the 19th century, but Miss, you would say Miss Jenny Wren. You would say Jenny, Miss Jenny, let's say Miss Jenny Wren, if she were the younger child in the family. The elder child would be just Miss Wren. Now, in this case, of course, she's the only child, so there's more flexibility there. It's a little bit like, all the political research I did, the classic one is John Russell, right? Why is he called Lord John Russell and not Lord Russell? It's because he's the only child. So it's some version of that. Now, if you look, I think it's right, too, if you look in the Oxford English Dictionary, it says this was a thing, but people didn't follow it consistently, which of course makes perfect sense. But it is interesting, it's Miss Wren, actually, and sort of wondered why that. That's an odd formality, because he is not, Lizzie Hexam is referred to one time as Miss, in the entire novel, and hundreds of times he refers to her as Miss Wren. And very few critics have picked up on it. It's interesting to me, the one critic that was using it frequently, now it's probably because when the article was written was Gareth Stewart in the Trials of the Imagination, years ago. It's still one of the best pieces on Jenny. But it's just
Following up on Jenny and Wren and Cleaver, do you have anything you want to say about Fanny?
doing Fanny.
Yeah.
Where did I see someone? Yeah, it was an article suggesting the. It was something about Fanny and what's the word, prurient wind or whatever, that kind of thing. After all, Fanny was very, very common in the 19th century. Dickens' own sister obviously is named Fanny. We know that in a number of instances in Dickens, Fanny is to one degree or another somewhat negative character. Fanny Dorr, for instance. And it probably reflects some mixed feelings about his sister and some jealousy. That's been argued about. It's hard for me to do too much with that. Because again, it was just a very common name. It's short for Francis, so it's just
Also, following up on this, I was just wondering about Jenny Wren from a kind of more strictly kind of ornithological point of view, because we're talking about these various different identities within Dickens's text. And you were talking about the various different cultural interpretations or representations of the Wren in popular culture and folklore and so forth. And I'm wondering to what extent Dickens was interested at all in the kind of ornithological, zoological reality beyond that. Can you imagine that that he would have maybe looked at an actual wren hopping about in his hedge in Gad's Hill, and that would have had any kind of effect, or was it all kind of mediated through these other texts?
That's a good question, and it's something that I thought about, but time being limited, I had not time to fully research yet. It did occur to me before, but it also occurred to me when I think it was Lillian. I think it was talking about wax figures. Yeah, Lillian, and you were talking about birds in the glass cages, and would one of them have been a wren? Now, obviously, it's not a moving wren. I also wanted to see, did he own any wrens? I have no idea. That's something I need to check. Obviously, it's one of the most common birds in England, so there would have been plenty of opportunity to observe the wren himself. Like everything with Dickens, I think a lot of it's probably his own observations. He's so, again, such a sort of prehensile imagination, he just seizes on everything. That's my guess.
Two last questions, if it's okay, because we are running out of time.
This is just a little bit about Jenny Wren as Miss Wren. Jenny's pressing goals in a higher class than she is, and the Miss Wren is almost a way of elevating her position.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Well, keep in mind.
The other time I think it's what you said, miss and all that she's missing, and it's also an elevation.
No, I think that's right. And keep in mind, what is her name? Well, her name is actually Miss Jenny Wren, because she says, because she's the first chapter she's in is book 2, chapter 1, whatever it's called. We don't get her name in that first chapter. We get all the other names, the person in the house and the old dressmaker, I think, that kind of thing. We only find her name out in the second chapter, and it says explicitly, Jenny introduces herself to people as Miss Jenny Wren, which is already kind of elevating herself. And on her card, remember she's got a business card, what is that? It's Miss Jenny Wren. So when she's introducing herself to other people, she's basically echoing her business card. This is her professional name, which she gives out. And so I absolutely agree with that sense of it's elevating in a way. And then, because then I started to look at Stella, in Great Expectations, how was she referred? Only 6 times is she referred to as Mrs. Stella or anything like that. And that's right at the beginning, because at one time you would use Miss is right early on. And then once you know them, you would use them.
And the last question.
I was just hoping, I think it's so amazing and intriguing to me as a teacher what you did working together and coming up with this, entire presentation. What was your process, especially because, and I'm not sure how your school year runs, but you've been done for a little while. So how did you keep working together, and how did you make sure everybody was, happy with each other's work and you were all kind of on the same page?
You take this.
Well, me and Colin for spring semester, we both did an internship. Essentially, we just got internship credit for it, just to keep working once a week with Leslie and with one of our other classmates, Grayson, just to work on mostly on the presentation and on the paper. We presented at a UVU symposium as well for humanities, so we kind of worked on that. So we kind of did keep it up through spring semester, just continuing to try and get all the information there. And then we met 2 or 3 times in the summer, just over Zoom, to kind of finish up everything for this presentation. So it was, we were kind of offered that at the end of fall semester by Leslie, and if anybody was interested in it. And then Victoria was there towards the second half as well, and I was kind of in the same position. I don't know if you want to talk more about that, but
I mean, I graduated in December, so I came back and did like an internship similar to what they did, and then, but yeah, I think we all, because it was only supposed to be 1 class. Like, I think the goal was to have a finished product by the end, and I think we just were not. Some students were like, fun. see you later.
Right.
Yeah. We did not feel that way. We were really excited. We just really loved the project. We love working with Leslie.
I think that's like, it's clear you guys are all.
I hope it is. She's really, she's amazing. But it just, she was like, oh, would you want to keep working on this? And we all said absolutely and talked a lot about it. So
It's awesome that you kept them engaged beyond the time they, the semester. So great
And
job.
we gotta have them come back next
Yes.
year, right? Can I also just say quickly, like they applied for their own grant at UVU, which their own travel grant. So they've been through the whole process of getting grant money, of summarizing the project. What are we doing? What are the benefits? What are the payoffs? Speaking the administrative speak. And so there's like a lot of professionalization that I've tried to add to this as part of that second semester's internship. But yeah, definitely we discovered that one semester was not enough to do as much reading and thinking as we were wanting to do and write a paper together that was maybe presentable and publishable. So as I said yesterday, I think if we were to do it again, if I were to try to do this again, it would be like a 2-semester sequence. But I encourage you to try it too. Yeah, why not, right? Yeah. Thank you, Magdalena.
I must just, during teaching Dickens session, a question was asked, why should we read and teach Dickens?
We have a pad here and paper.
And I think that's why. Yes, they are the best answer, that's why. Those three.
Go right.